Chapter 24, page 159. At first I lived in great fear, even in my dreams, and I was afraid to speak. I did nothing spontaneously or haphazardly. Every glance, every turn of my head was thought out in advance and deliberately executed. Inside myself I spoke aloud. I sang or screamed or cried, but the face I presented to my fellow villagers was always the same. I saw them at first as a mob of antagonists that I neither liked nor trusted. Man or woman, young or old, they were the same in my eyes. Those who had lived in the village longest inhabited the mud dwellings with interiors that boasted rug-covered earthen floors and 2 or 3 pieces of furniture. Others lived in tents or black goat hair cloth, and the rest slept on woolen mattresses under worn blankets or comforters. During the day, all were busy with one thing or another, milking the goats, churning butter, hunting for food, or gathering together in religious worship. "Come to prayer," the muezzin cried early in the morning. "Prayer is better than sleep." I observed their religious ceremonies with interest, the chants, the prostrations and prayers for protection and blessings, and my heart was softened by what I saw. "God is great," the muezzin proclaimed to the congregation. "Thee only do we worship, to thee do we cry for help." I had never witnessed an Islamic service before and found it in spirit not very different from the church services that my family and I had attended every Sunday in Bitlis. The faces in worship were the same, the hope and the pain and devotion in their eyes was the same, and in their hearts, as in mine, lived the same longing for a better world and a better life. Gradually, as my own voice grew quiet within me, I was able to distinguish from the 70 or 80 villagers certain names, certain faces, certain traits that separated them. The eyes of one, the laughter of another, a gesture of compassion or humility. There was Kizim, small with violent eyes, who hunted with his younger brother Rashid. There was Mustafa, who killed the sheep, and Shiran, Mustafa's daughter, who sheared the sheep and gave them names. There was Sat, who made faces for me to laugh at, and Yaqub, who spoke with great energy and humor, and Aziz, who taught me how to tend the sheep, and Asmat, Aziz's brother, who liked to drink wine and fire his rifle at the sky. At night I ate with them before the fires and listened to the stories they told. They talked about their lives before the war, about a sister or brother who had been killed, about the men and great beasts they had slain. All but one was convinced that I was deaf and mute, and Mustafa, dark lined face, sharp black eyes, and heavy gray brows, would never be convinced. It was Mustafa who'd walked over to me my first day in the village and squeezed my ear so hard that I screamed. It was Mustafa who kicked me when he called my name, the name they had given me, and I did not answer. He looked at me and his eyes said he knew. He knew my parents were dead, knew I was Armenian, knew I should be dead. At night by the fires, he cursed the Armenians and said that the war would be over if the Turkish army had not been betrayed in vain. His 2 sons had been killed by the Russian army, but he blamed the Armenians, the infidels he called them. I made it my business to stay as far away from him as possible, hoping that in time he would either accept me or forget about me. Most of my days were spent in the field watching the sheep and the donkey. Sometimes Yaqub and Sat would join me and would play the pebble game of gap. The name they gave me was Galib, and as the weeks and months passed, I became more and more willing to think of myself as Galib, to see the village through Galib's eyes, and hear only the science inside myself. And, as Galib, it was not hard for me to think of the village as my home, or to see in each face something that reminded me of the faces of my own friends and family. In Sat, I sometimes saw Patu, in Aziz I saw Tavel, and in Rashid I saw Manouche. In Shiran I saw no one I had never known, but I liked her face most of all. I had hardly noticed her when I first came to the village, but soon I found myself watching her, wondering what she was thinking. It seemed to me that she was as much a stranger in the village as I, for she spent most of her time alone, rarely speaking to the others. Though she was only 16 or 17 years old, her black hair was graying and her eyes were as dark and knowing as a woman twice her age. If she had had anyone but Mustafa for a father, she might have been happy, but he was as much her curse as he was mine. Still, she remained a dutiful daughter. She served him his meals, sat beside him while he ate, bore his insults when he drank, and did not cry or make a sound when he struck her, but she kept her heart to herself. The rains that summer were as gentle as a mother's kiss, sweetening the air and ripening the soul and refreshing the soul and the senses. In the daytime I heard the echoes of gunfire in the forest. At night I feasted on many kinds of meat. Aziz put his arm around me one evening and said, "This is my son." Sharon smiled at me. When I looked at her, she turned away. Kazim took me hunting. He did not tell me what we were hunting for, but when we returned, he announced to the others that I was a born hunter. Sate had fear and spoke wildly for many days. I liked Sate and was afraid he would die. In his delirium, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "My friend," over and over until I thought I would cry. I prayed for him to recover. I prayed in Armenian and Turkish so that God would be sure to hear me, and when he recovered, I embraced him as I might have embraced Patu. At night, I no longer dreamed about my family. One day, while I was looking after the sheep, I heard footsteps behind me. This was not unusual. Sometimes Jacob and Sate would sneak up behind me and try to scare me by covering my eyes, but I always heard them and was always ready. And I was ready now for one or the other, and also for Mustafa, who never left my mind for a moment. But it was Shiran who sat beside me, and when I saw her, all my breath seemed to leave my body. I looked at her, feeling my face redden, and she smiled. I turned from her and watched the clouds drift across the sky. Shiran looked at the clouds. If at that moment she had asked me who I was, I would have told her. If she had asked me if I was Armenian, I would have said yes. I would have told her anything, but she didn't say a word. She began to sing softly to herself. I listened, looking at the brown hills beyond the field. I closed my eyes and imagined that she was singing for me, that the warm wind on my face was the breath of her song. I wondered if she would have sat with me if she had known that I wasn't deaf. I wonder if she would have sung for me if she had known that I was Armenian. I wanted to look at her, but I was afraid that she would see in my eyes that I could hear her. But I had to look at her, and when I did, she stopped and smiled. "I'm not talking," she explained. "I'm only singing." I looked at her curiously. "Singing," she said, and then she sighed. "I wish you understood." "I understand," my mind said. "No, I don't," she said. "I'm glad you don't understand." Far away, I heard Mustafa's voice calling her, but she did not answer or even turn her head. "Shiran!" The voice was closer now, but still she didn't answer. I waited, and finally I heard his footsteps behind us. "You are not a shepherd, Shiran," Mustafa's voice said. "Leave that to him." After dinner that evening, Mustafa stood up, his face flushed with wine, his belly tight with food, and began to dance. Kazim joined in, and then Aziz and Sate. Soon all the men were dancing, and Kazim took off his shirt and made great circles with it as he danced. The other men did the same, while their women watched and laughed and clapped. I had never seen such dancing or heard such laughter in my life, and I wanted to join in, wanted to stand and dance and clap with the others. One of the men reached out to Shiran, but she shook her head. Then she looked across the fire at me. That night I lay under my blankets and thought about her, and I told her that I was Armenian, and she said that she knew. "How?" "I know you," she said, "the same way you know me." I told her that she was beautiful, and she shook her head. "Only to you," she said, "only for you." I looked at the moon and wondered if she was looking at the same moon, her thoughts answering mine. I could hear the few remaining revelers in the distance, drunk sounding and fraternal, and I fell asleep in their voices. So he only imagined that he told her. He didn't really tell her that he was Armenian. Y'all got that, right? Okay. I do not remember what I dreamed, only that I was suddenly awake. Something heavy shifted on the grass beside me. I listened, but heard only the crickets in the wind. "Galib," a voice whispered. "Galib." It was Mustafa. "Open your eyes, my friend. I won't hurt you." I felt his face close to mine and his breath hot and sour with wine. "No one is going to hurt you, my friend. I only want you to open your eyes so we can talk. You must be tired of your game by now." He was leaning over me, and I felt his knee against the back of mine, and a cold sweat collected on my chest and under my arms. It took all my concentration to keep my body still and my breathing deep and rhythmical. "You can make fools of the others, Galib, but you cannot make a fool of me. I am not a fool, Galib. I have eyes, and they see who is lying and who is telling the truth." Even with my eyes closed, I could feel him watching me, searching my face for some sign that I heard him. "Your family is dead," he said. "I know that. My family is dead too. My sons are dead. My name is dead. But listen to me, Galib. Your name will die too. Do you hear me, Armenian? Your name will die too." The next day I was left alone to watch the sheep. Sate had asked if he could stay with me, and Mustafa told him he could not. It was a hot day, so I tied the donkey rope around my legs so that he would not lead the sheep to the shade of the rocks or to the hills beyond the field. I was sitting on the grass, my back against a rock. I had been too frightened to sleep the night before, and now my eyes were heavy, and the wind and the warm sun were like a blanket. I closed my eyes and opened them. I closed my eyes and slept. And then someone was kicking me. "Where are the sheep?" Mustafa said. I opened my eyes and saw that the donkey and the sheep were gone. 20 or 30 others were looking at the grass where the sheep had been, talking loud and fast, pointing beyond the rocks, pointing beyond the trees. In every face there was fear. Mustafa pulled me up to my feet. "Where are the sheep, boy?" He was smiling. I looked at him. "You fell asleep, huh?" He turned to Sate, who was watching helplessly. "Find the sheep," he said. The villagers had scattered in every direction, whistling for the sheep and calling the donkey. Only Mustafa stayed behind. The sun was low in the sky. "That was a stupid thing to do, my friend." He clapped his hands and swung hard into my belly. I dropped to my knees, and all the air was gone from my body. Mustafa's boot flashed toward my face and missed. I tried to stand, and he kicked out and caught me on the side of the head. He pulled me up by my hair and brought his knee up between my legs. "Ooh, did you think you could fool me?" he said. He clasped his hands and brought them down on the back like a sledgehammer. He kicked and missed and kicked again and caught me in the ribs. "Did you think you could fool a Turk?" I tried to roll away, and my head was stung, and then I saw the blood, beads and tracks of bloods. I swam up to my feet, and my head was blown back, and I heard a crack, and I knew that my nose was broken. I felt something sharp in my ribs, in my back, 3, 4, 5 blows, thump, 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 like drums. Again I tried to stand, and again I was blown back, my face in the dirt, from far away. "You cannot make a fool of me." Late that night the others returned with the sheep and the donkey. Not one sheep had been lost. I lay on my back far from the fires. Sate and Shiran had bought me food, but I would not eat. Shiran tried to sit beside me, but I waved her away. I did not want anyone to see me. I closed my eyes and felt every punch and every kick. I ran my tongue over my teeth and felt the ones that were loose. I did not touch my nose because I knew it was broken. I was glad that my mother and father could not see me now. For the first time in many months, I did not know what would become of me. I knew I should leave, but I did not know where to go. Without this village, I would have no home. I would have streets to beg on and roads where the dead were not buried. I would have my tongue, but who would I speak to? I was afraid to leave, and I hated my fear. My father would never have lived among these enemies, but my father was dead, and the unknown went on forever. The unknown filled the sky and darkened the far trees and the world beyond them. Perhaps someday I would speak to the villagers, and they would not kill me. Perhaps someday I could laugh at Yukup's stories and tell Shiran she was beautiful. And wasn't Sate my friend? They were all my friends, and Mustafa could not hate me forever. I looked deep into the night, half hoping to see my father's eyes. I raised my head and saw that the fires were gone, and slowly I turned on my side and tried to stand. "No," a voice said, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Shiran. I raised my hand to wave her away, and she took my hand and held it. "Rest," she said. Gradually my wounds healed. My nose was still fat, but it did not hurt so much when I touched it. As time passed, I no longer thought about leaving, and I told myself that the village was my home. I was certain that Mustafa was finished with me. It was as though all his hate had gone into beating me, and now he was empty. He ate in silence and drank alone. Sate carved me a knife. We threw rocks at targets and made faces in the dirt with knives. He cut our names in a tree and said we were brothers. Shiran no longer came to the field, and at dinner we sat on opposite sides of the fire. When I looked at her, she shook her head slightly, and I knew that Mustafa had forbidden her to talk to me. One afternoon, Sate and I were playing gap on the dirt path that separated the field from the dwellings of the village. I was winning, and Sate had become so quiet that I knew that he was only a minute or two away from forfeiting. He picked up the pebbles, tossed them in the air, and caught 3 on the back of his hand. I picked up the pebbles, tossed them in the air, and caught 6. I waited for Sate to write down the score, but he was not looking at me. He was looking past me, and his expression had changed. I turned and saw the soldiers. There were 2 of them walking up the mountain road, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The bearded man between them had no shirt, and his pants were torn and bloody. He had many wounds on his body, and the wounds were packed with dirt. His face was crusted with dirt and blood, and his arms hung loosely at his sides. He fell to his knees, and the soldiers dragged him until he found his feet again. The villagers began to talk among themselves. I heard Armenian many times and felt something sickening stir inside me. I looked at the man's pants, and I could see that they had been made from fine material. I tried to meet the man's eyes, but his eyes met nothing. He must have been hiding in the mountains for months. Mustafa whispered something to Kayazem, and Kayazem nodded, still watching the soldiers. I looked at Sate helplessly, as I would have looked at Sisak or Patu, but Sate shrugged his shoulders as if to say, he's only an Armenian. The villagers gathered 20 or 30 feet from the soldiers and their prisoner. I searched for Shiran, who was standing well behind the others. I saw her turn and walk quickly toward the field. One of the soldiers said something to Mustafa, and Mustafa nodded his approval. The other soldier tied the prisoner to a tree, walked a few feet away, and raised his rifle. The prisoner moved his lips but made no sound. He closed his eyes, and the soldier aimed but did not shoot. The prisoner opened his eyes and began to shake. He looked at the soldier steadily. "Shoot," he said in Armenian. The soldier placed his finger on the trigger and waited. "Shoot," the prisoner said. The soldier waited, and everyone was silent. The prisoner began to beat the back of his head against the tree, and there was a shot and a crack, and he was dead. The bullet had passed through his mouth. That night I lay under my blankets, my eyes open. After the soldiers had taken the prisoner's boots, the children looked through his pockets, and the bravest touching the hole at the back of his head and instantly recoiling. I remembered looking desperately from face to face, hoping to find some sign of grief or horror, but I'd seen nothing. Mustafa had already turned away, and Kayazem was talking animatedly to the soldiers. Jakob sat beneath a tree and closed his eyes. And Sate, my brother, my best friend, Sate looked at the body quizzically and ran his tongue across his lips because they were dry. My throat had ached because I could not scream, and my head hurt because I could not cry. There was something thick and salty in my throat, something like hardened tears or rage that swelled whenever I swallowed. I prayed for the dead man's soul in Armenia, and I hated the people I thought were my friends. I remember seeing all but Shiran and believing all but Shiran would have killed me for what I was. I was not Galib, and this was not my home, and these people were not my family. I had known that the instant I heard the shot, and when the prisoner slumped forward, I saw my father and my brothers and myself. I had known then that I was leaving, that I had to leave. It was late now, and I listened to the silence of the village. I folded my blankets, left the knife Sate had carved for me on the ground, and began to walk toward the spot where Shiran slept under a blanket outside her father's tent. I walked slowly, carefully, not to make a sound. I passed Rashid, Amar, and Aziz. I could see Shiran now lying beneath her blankets. I could hear Mustafa snoring inside his horsehair tent and feel my heart beating against my chest. I walked the last 10 feet and looked at her sleeping face. I was afraid to touch her, afraid she would scream. I crouched beside her, knowing I did not have much time and that I was a fool to take such a chance. I touched her shoulder lightly, but she did not move. I touched her face, my hand ready to cover her mouth, and her eyes opened and she looked at me. I put my finger to my lips and she nodded. I opened my mouth to speak, but made no sound. I leaned forward and pressed my lips against her cheek. "Thank you," I whispered, first in her language and then in my own. She sat up and I was on my feet, and then I was running.